Hello, my name is Patrick Lee, and I'm from Franciscan University of Steubenville. And I'm going to speak about called the natural law perspective on embryonic stem cell research. What I will be presenting here are a set of reflections, an argument that does not draw on faith, that does not, nowhere in my argument do I draw any premises from the Bible or from church teaching. So this is an argument or a set of reflections that could be made by someone, whether he's Catholic, whether he's Christian, whether he's Jewish, Muslim, whatever, or no faith whatsoever. So I'm going to just try to appeal just to science and to logic and philosophy. It's not just science alone. The issue here, let me just first of all say what the issue here is. The issue is called the issue of embryonic stem cell research. And the problem, of course, is, in a way, the issue is very often misnamed. It's not just about stem cell research because, as noted before, there are several types of stem cells. That's not the problem. It's not even a problem about embryonic stem cell research. The problem is how to obtain those embryonic stem cells. The problem is that the human embryo must be dismembered in order to obtain his or her stem cells. And that is a real sticking problem. That is a real serious problem. If the human embryo, I want to get something else here. Oh, there we go. Okay. If the human embryo is a human being, right, if that is the case, if the human embryo is a human being or if the human embryo is a human person, then what we would be saying is that it is in some cases morally okay to dismember one human being for the benefit of others. And so we can look at the issue, we'll go on and we'll further look at what this being is, but the first point here is setting aside what we're going to say about whether this human embryo is a human being. The issue is a serious one, but it's a question of principle. Is it ever morally right to dismember one human being for the sake of the benefit of others? And I would say, I will argue that the human embryo is a human being, is a human person, and therefore this is not morally right. The end does not justify the means. If the embryo, if we were speaking about, say, infants, if we were speaking about 6-year-old infants or retarded, six-week-old retarded babies, and the question someone proposed that we could dismember these 6-week-old retarded babies and then use their body parts for the sake of others, no one would say that that is the debate here is a transplantation issue. The issue would not be about organ transplantation. The issue would be about whether it is right to kill retarded human beings for the benefit of others. And this, by the same token, the issue here cannot be settled by talking about how many people embryonic stem cells may cure or may help in treatment. The issue has to be faced up to what are these beings. So if this is a human being, then this is a serious problem. I'm having a serious problem with this advancing here. Is this? Oh, there we go. But are they human beings? Okay. So the question is, when do you and I, wait a minute here, is this, yeah, this is right. When do you and I come to be? That is, I think, or at least not, that's not the only issue in the embryonic stem cell debate, but that is certainly one of the central key issues. Now, the basic thing that I would say is that what you and I are human organisms. That's the kind of being that you and I are. That's the kind of thing that you and I are. But the human organisms, so whenever the human organism comes to be, that's when you and I come to be. I could put it this way. You could ask, well, okay, when does the person come to be? When does the thing that we refer to as I? I would say the person comes to be when the thing that is referred to by a personal pronoun comes to be. So when is it that the I comes to be? When is it that the thing that is referred to by I or by you or by he, when does that entity come to be? When does that substantial entity come to be? Well, whenever that thing comes to be, then the thing that you are, or the thing that I am, comes to be. So since what I am is a human organism, and what you are is a human organism, whenever the human organism came to be, that's when you and I came to be. So the question is then, when does the human organism come to be? This is my only graphic, and if there are children present, you better. This is some nudity here. Sorry about that. Although I have several children and I have some grandchildren, I am still embarrassed about speaking about the birds and the bees, the very coming to be of human life. And even though I do that for a living, as it were, but in any case, we need to talk about some of the basic facts of human reproduction, normal human reproduction. And you can see up here, I don't have a pointer here, but on the left, of course, that we're going to talk about what happens in normal fertilization. A human embryo can be produced, most human embryos are produced by sexual intercourse, and then the sperm unites with the ovum, and that gives rise to a human embryo. Nowadays, of course, we can get the same result, a human embryo, by in vitro fertilization, which is still fertilization, but in vitro rather than in vivo in the uterine tube, or by cloning might be a possibility in the near future. But I would say that at least in some cases, if the cloning is successful, the result will be the same as the result in fertilization, namely a human embryo. So what are the basic facts? Well, you are familiar, most of you are familiar with, I'm sure, with the basic facts, is that if you go up there at A, that refers to the meeting where the place, generally the place where the sperm meets the ovum, or the sperm meets the oocyte. So after sexual intercourse, the sperm, some of the sperm can move through the uterus in through the fallopian tube, and one of those sperm will be able to penetrate, if a conception occurs, one of the sperm will penetrate an ovum or an oocyte, and the sperm will join with the oocyte. The sperm and the ovum will cease to be and give rise to a new thing, something different from either one. And that is originally called a zygote. That's the embryo at the one-cell stage. And then that zygote, or that embryo, begins to grow by a process of differentiation. And if you look at B, at 2 days, it's divided into 4 cells. C, at 3 days, it's a morula. It's into maybe 16 cells. And then by about 4 days, it's maybe 62, 100 cells. And it's also, by 4 days, it has differentiated into a blastocyst. It is differentiated into at least two types of cells: the inner cell mass, which are basically the precursors for the whole body of the embryo, and the trophoblast, which is the precursor for the placenta, chorion, amnion, and so forth. Okay, and then at about 6 days, the embryo is traveling down through the fallopian tube, then into the uterus, and at 6 days it begins to implant, And this is something it does actively, and it's something that it has been developing itself in a certain way to prepare for this act of implanting on the uterus, and it takes it a while to implant on the uterus. Okay, so what happens at fertilization? I think fertilization is a very important stage here. At fertilization, a sperm and an ovum join, and they cease to be, as I mentioned ago. Once the sperm enters the ovum, the film or the outer edges of the ovum change in its property, and now it repels any further penetration of other sperms. The sperm also changes, it breaks up, it loses its tail, it loses its head. Basically, its genetic material is sort of stripped off from it inside what was formerly the ovum. So at that point, you no longer have a sperm, you no longer have an ovum, you no longer have a male sex cell and a female sex cell. At that point, you have a new thing that has been generated by the joining of those two. At that stage, it's a zygote or a one-celled embryo. And this, of course, this embryo can be produced by other means. I think other than sexual intercourse, it could be produced by fertilization in vitro, or perhaps in the future by cloning. Let's see, going on to another, there we go. Now, there are three things I would like to, I think 3 points, and it's important to divide these points logically, 3 distinct points that can be made about this embryo. First of all, the embryo is clearly the embryos are distinct individuals. They are not parts of the mother in which they reside. This is clear from the fact that they grow in their own direction. Okay? The cells, the parts of an organism, function for the survival and maintenance of the organism of which they are parts. But these embryos, the human embryo does not. It grows in its own distinct direction, and it divides and differentiates itself in a manner that is for its own survival and its own maintenance, and its own flourishing, rather than that of the mother. So this is a distinct being. Secondly, it's obviously a human, something human. It's a product of humans, and it has the genetic structure that is characteristic of humans. But in the third point I want to make of this human, of the embryo, and this is perhaps the most important, is that this is a whole human being. And this is an important point because there is, of course, human tissue or human cells. If you grab onto something, you will inevitably leave several skin cells there on the handle or on the chair. And there are beating hearts. You take a heart out of a body to transplant. You have the beating heart in the chest. That's not a whole human being. So there are human individuals that are not whole human beings, that are functionally parts. But here, in this case, this is a whole human being. It's not functionally a part. How do we know that? Well, the evidence here is that it has the material structure. It has the genetic and epigenetic program, not just the genetic program, but the genes are arranged and modified in such a way so that it has that genetic and epigenetic program that gives it an orientation or an active disposition to develop itself to the mature stage of a human being. Okay? So already within this structure, it has the composition that has the material structure that gives it an active dynamism toward self-development to the mature stage of a human being. All it needs, that's one part. And secondly, we can see this again, is that secondly, all this being needs is a suitable environment in order to develop and it also needs nutrition and also the absence of disease and accident. But all it needs is a suitable environment and nutrition in order to actively develop itself to the mature stage of a human being. How do we know what a thing is? We know what a thing is by how it can act. In other words, we have different types of things. You have a tree, you have a dog, you have this kind of tree, you have that kind of dog. They're differentiated by what? By the kinds of actions they are programmed to perform, or the kinds of actions that they are internally oriented to performing. So a dog is different from a tree. Why? Because of its inherent nature. And what is the inherent nature of a thing? The inherent nature of a thing is the structure of the thing that orients it to act and react in a certain way. So when we look at the embryo, it is a stable body. All the cells together form a stable body, and the cells function as parts for the sake of the maintenance and development of this this entity, this unit, toward the stage at which it will do all of the kinds of actions that you and I are able to do today. So if you put these 3 points together, and I think these 3 points are points that we can see. Actually, so far I'm just talking about the biology of the thing. I'm asking what kind of thing this is. These 3 points are points that can be shown by biology or by embryology. And in fact, if you consult the embryology text, the standard embryology textbooks, all of them will say, well, you and I, or the human being, individual, began at fertilization. They still say that, okay? And so it's not that right-wing people or Catholics or whatever are bucking science. It's not religious people bucking science. No, we're the ones who are defending science, okay? And we're using science. Now, science alone doesn't establish all of these points, because there's another point here I need to make. But it's the science books that are saying, oh, this is when a human individual begins, or this is when a human organism begins. Okay, so and I've gone over some of the evidence for that is, okay, it's distinct, it's a human, but it's also a whole, not functionally apart, but a whole human being. So it's a distinct, whole, although obviously immature, human being. Okay, now, from there you can see that this embryo also, it actively develops itself. And it's a complex series. This is not, the embryo from day one is not just a clump of cells. There's differentiated process going on there. The cells are working together as parts of a whole. It is true that you could, before day 14, you could extract, well, before, say, day 8, you could certainly extract any of those cells, and those cells, after they're extracted, could become a whole. But when they are within the whole, they are not functioning as wholes. Otherwise, you'd have 8 different. They would be growing in 8 different directions. Rather, when they are within the whole, when they function as parts of a whole. So it goes through It goes through a series, a complex series of internally directed sequence, a complex series of internally directed events. Right? A coordinated series of events, internally directed. It goes through at the 8-cell stage. The cells come together and compact toward each other. Then the middle of the embryo begins to hollow out and fill with fluid. That's called cavitation. The cells at the 8-cell stage form these tight junctions. The inner cells form tight junctions so that they can intercommunicate with each other. In other words, send signals to each other so that they are not all doing the same sorts of things. There's differential gene expression. There's evidence that even from the 2-cell stage, there is different gene expression. There is an asymmetry between one cell and another cell, that there's more of one type of gene being expressed, in particular the CDX2 gene is being expressed, which is which triggers the development of the trophoblast, which is the precursor of the placenta. So it's, and then at the 16 cell stage, there's the cavitation, the sort of hollowing out in the middle, and by day 3 or 4, there's a differentiation into two types of cells, the inner cell mass and the trophoblast. And that basic differentiation has been in preparation for in the previous days. I'm trying to go through, okay. And this is just some idea of, just give you some pictures of the development, the active self-development. I think what we see throughout the development of the embryo is an internally coordinated series of events that form the active self-development of a single organism. Trying to go to the next, okay, there we go. Well, I had that, okay. Let me just go there. Well, are you guys doing that back there, or am I? Okay. Here's the 8-week-old embryo, and let me see, we go through the next one here. Can I go to the next one, or, okay, there we go. So the basic argument here, let me see if I can get this, is that the direction of growth is determined from within, from day one. Right? And from day one, the embryo at each stage has, first of all of the information needed within it, all of the organizational information that is needed, and the active disposition to develop itself in accord with that information to the mature stage of a human. So it does not develop into a human being. It already is a human being, just at an earlier stage of development. If I can go to the next one here. Okay. Now, in the last slides, I was talking about the biology of it. Here I want to add something else here. If it is true that you and I are organisms, if that's the basic kind of thing that we are, rather than, say, consciousnesses or spirits that have organisms, but if we are particular types of organisms, then we came to be when these organisms came to be. So you and I came to be when the organism came to be, but the organism came to be when the embryo came to be. That's when you had an entity, had a biological entity with a fundamental active disposition to develop itself to the mature stage of a human being. Now, so A is you and I came to be when the embryo that you and I are came to be, or you and I were came to be. But then secondly, I would say B, here the second step is I think that we are valuable, or we are intrinsically valuable as subjects of rights in virtue of the kind of being, the fundamental kind of being that we are. And this is an important additional point. What makes you a thing or an entity that is intrinsically valuable as a subject of rights? We divide the universe into two types of entities. I mean, there may be grades, even more than two types of entities. We treat animals, I think, better than we should treat animals, I think, better than we treat plants and so forth. But there is a fundamental divide between persons on the one hand, or full subjects of rights on the one hand, versus things, or at least things that we can use for food and perhaps just put to death when they are suffering too much on the other hand. So what is it that makes you a subject of rights? What is it that makes you and I a subject of rights the kind of thing that we ought not to use for food, the kind of thing that we ought to treat as we would treat ourselves, the kind of thing that that the golden rule applies to. Well, I would say, this is my point B, is that what makes you and I a subject of rights is not any of the accidental attributes that you and I acquire after we come to be, but the fundamental kind of thing that you and I are. We differ in all sorts of respects. We differ in size, we differ in appearance, we differ in religion, we differ in gender, we differ in level of intelligence, in degree of development. But none of those things, I think, are what make us valuable as subjects of rights. What makes you and me valuable as subjects of rights is the fundamental kind of thing that we are. Not any accidental attributes that we acquire later on. Now, what is the fundamental kind of thing that you and I are? Well, I would say that we are persons. We are human persons. And what is a person? Well, I would say a person is the kind of thing that has within it the active disposition, or the sort of active capacity, the active potentiality to develop itself to the point where it can reason, make free choices, shape his or her own life. Now, if we are subject, we go point B, if you grant point B, that we are subject of rights because of the kind of being we are, then it would follow that you and I were subject of rights as soon as we came to be. We did not first come to be at one point and then acquire rights at some later time. Rather, we were subject of rights from the moment that we came to be. So you and I have been subject of rights at all times that we existed. We didn't first come to be and then become subject of rights later on. But if you and I once were embryos, which I think has been shown earlier, then you and I were subject of rights when we were embryos. So you and I once were embryos. If what makes you and I subject of rights is what we are, then we were subject of rights when we were embryos. And that means embryos are subject of rights. Okay, I want to go to the next one, see if I can go to the next one. Okay. Trying to get another point up there. Okay. Well, one of the objections to this argument is to say that, well, someone might say, I grant that this is a human being, that a human embryo is a human being, or a human fetus is a human being, but it's not a person. It doesn't have self-consciousness. Someone might say, well, the only thing that is valuable or subject of value is a person rather than all human beings. So, and some human beings are not persons. We could add that if we look at the human embryo, and I think this is an important sort of emotional point, when we look at the human embryo, he's so small and he looks so different from you and I think it just doesn't look like a human being. He's no larger than the period at the end of a sentence. Right? So what about this objection? Well, let's see if I can get the answer up here. Okay. So that's the objection. There's a human but not a person. Here is how I would reply to that. Right? Is, first of all, I would say that, first of all, what I am is a particular, going back to reiterate, what I am is a particular kind of organism. The human person is not a spirit or a consciousness that has a body, but it is a particular kind of organism. So I, or you, or she, came to be when this organism came to be. So the I, you, and what we refer to as I, you, or he, that's what the person is. And since I think, refers to this organism, then that is, in the case of the human being, that is what the person is. And so the person came to be exactly when the organism came to be. I'm going to go to the next point here. My next point about this argument is that a human organism does not, a human embryo does not have a capacity to be self-conscious right now. In other words, he does not have, he cannot right now be self-conscious. It will take, but nevertheless, this being is very different from a dog embryo or a cat embryo or something like that. The human embryo has within himself the internal resources to actively develop himself or herself to the stage at which he or she will be fully self-conscious, reason, make free choices, and so on. So we could say he or she has a radical capacity or a radical potentiality in the sense that he or she has the internal resources to actively develop himself or herself to the point at which he or she will reason, make free choices, and so on. And it seems to me that that basic radical capacity, which is really the same as the kind of being you are, that's what distinguishes you from another type of being, is that radical basic potentiality which you have from the moment that you come to be. That's what is the basis for whether a being is a subject of rights or not, rather than what we might call a sort of an immediately exercisable capacity, a capacity that might be exercised in the next 15 minutes or so. And this is my last slide, if I can get it up here, I think. Okay. On this same point about, well, maybe it's a person, maybe it's a human being, but not a person. We could consider a person in a coma, or a reversible coma. If you talk about an irreversible coma, not everyone is going to agree. But consider a person in a reversible coma. That person cannot right now be self-conscious. And that person, it may take that person several days to recover self-consciousness. But still, it's the kind of being that has the basic capacity to be self-conscious. So one might say, well, he's been self-conscious before, or he's made free choices or reasoning before. But why would the previous free choices, the previous reasoning, give you present rights? The basis of rights is not desires, I think. Rather, some desires are reasonable, some are not. So it's not desires that give us reason. It's the kind, I think, it's the kind of being that one is. So I would say the most reasonable explanation for why someone in a reversible coma is still a person, even though he can't right now have self-consciousness or reason or make free choices, is because this is the same kind of being that he has been all throughout his life. He's the same kind of being as you or I. He still has the basic natural capacity for self-consciousness, even though it will take him some time to develop that capacity. And this is what is true, but this is true also of the human embryo. The human embryo is a thing that has a substantial entity that has the basic natural capacity for self-consciousness, even though it will take him or her some time to develop that self-consciousness, to develop himself to the point, himself or herself to the point where that self-consciousness will be manifested. And so in that sense, I would say, then we should say that the human embryo is a person. By person here, meaning a substantial entity with a rational nature. It is a rational being. It can't exercise its rationality in the next 15 minutes or in the next several months, but if we provide him or her with a suitable environment, eventually he or she will. The question about, well, another last objection, and I'll leave, I don't have a slide on this, but a last question that comes up is that perhaps in the first 14 days, because this being can split into two, maybe it's not really one being, maybe it's a group of beings. And I have several problems with that idea that the embryo does not come to be until day 14, say when the primitive streak occurs, or perhaps until when the brain begins to function at 8 weeks. Any of those, I think, this objection from twinning, or this objection that, well, there needs to be a larger degree of development, is, I think, the problem I have with the twinning objection is that from the fact that you can divide a thing into two, it does not follow that prior to that division, it was not a single being, okay? And I think most of the twinning occurs, most of sort of identical, we're talking about identical twinning, right? Or monozygotic twinning, where an embryo that began as a single zygote, then at some point something can happen so that some of the cells from the inner cell mass are detached from the original embryo and then begin to grow on their own and are at that stage a new embryo. I think from the fact that that can be divided, it doesn't follow that there was not a single embryo before that. Between day 1 and day 5, there is a coordinated series, an organized series of development. And that organized series of development, I think, does not have a good explanation for it unless we posit or unless we conclude that there is an embryo right there. There is a single organism internally coordinating that development. And so there is evidence that it is a single organism from day 1 to day 5 or day 9 or day 14. And then I think that therefore what occurs in that monozygotic twinning apparently is that A divides into B and C. Now then either A is identical with B or C, or A dies, giving rise to B and C. I think it's, in most cases, I think it's more likely that A is identical with B or C. In other words, that the twinning is very much like sort of natural cloning here, that there's a division of this being, and this gives rise to a second entity, but the original embryo continues to be. So I go back to the basic argument is really a simple one, is that, first of all, what makes you and I valuable is the kind of being you and I are. The kind of being you and I are is a particular type of organism. That particular type of organism comes to be when the human embryo comes to be. Therefore, what makes you and I valuable comes to be when the human embryo comes to be. Thank you.